Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour or so then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist and author, Isabel Oakeshott. How lovely to see you both. Hello to you. As ever, let's start with the front pages, shall we? The Daily Mirror then, leading with German investigators digging up an allotment in the search for Madeleine McCann. The Express says 100 officers are now working on the excavation. It's also the lead story for The Star. Maddie cops dig up veg patch is their take on the story. Meanwhile, Europe has a second wave. That is the lead for the Metro, with Boris Johnson's warning that increasing numbers of holidaymakers returning from abroad may be forced to self-isolate. Indeed, a senior advisor to Mr Johnson has told the Daily Mail that the Prime Minister fears there could be a second wave in the UK within a fortnight. And it seems that he believes a second wave is already underway in Europe, according to The Times, naming other countries which could be included in the quarantine for incoming travellers. There's the FT, though, saying that the whole of Europe is fighting a spike in the virus as lockdowns ease and tourism grows. While the Scotsman quotes First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's advice, "I would not book a foreign holiday right now." The Daily Telegraph quotes the chief executive of Heathrow Airport calling for COVID-19 testing to be administered at airports. The Guardian is leading with calls for free school meals to be extended to tackle a growing food poverty crisis. While the Eye has word of a possible new test for Alzheimer's, which could detect the disease as much as 2 decades sooner than before. Should we want to know, I think. Sonia Sodha, Isabel Oakeshott, then I'll hear. It's a depressing set of COVID headlines, isn't it, to be fair? Isabel, let's go to you first of all. The Prime Minister's fears of a second wave in 2 weeks. They're even putting time limits on this.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knew, I think, that there would be a second wave. The government has for a long time been talking about the possibility of a second wave coming in the autumn, and people have been somewhat kind of psyched up for that. What is apparently going on now, though, is that we've got a big surge in infections in a number of countries in Europe. And it looks as if the government is becoming very, very rattled by this and fears that there could be a significant uplift in numbers here within the next fortnight, which does beg the question, how many more waves might we have before Christmas if every time the lockdown is eased, the numbers pick up again. So it is extremely worrying, I think, for everybody really, but for businesses, those that are just cautiously reopening, thinking now, are we going to have to shut down again? For people who have been shielding, wondering whether actually they can safely come out again, just an incredibly gloomy picture, really.
Yes, Tuesday afternoon's latest figures on the number of lab-confirmed COVID tests was 581, but the Daily Mail here suggesting that the 7-day average stands at nearly 700, which is 28% up on 3 weeks ago, which seems to be the basis of this article. Is there real concern about seeding from abroad? Was it Chris Whitty who suggested that's why travellers from Spain needed to join quarantine, Sonia?
Yeah, so that was behind that. So there were 10 travellers returning from Spain who have tested positive for COVID once they got back. So I think that's where the concerns about that came from. And I think the government was right to act very swiftly in terms of imposing the 14-day quarantine. But there are real questions about, I think lots of people feel like it's really unfair because they didn't realise the risks when they decided to go on holiday. And I think the government's being clearer about that now, but it could have been done with being clearer about it 4 weeks ago. But what a shift in tone. Just like 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were all being told by the Prime Minister, it's time to sort of start getting back to normal, to do our bit for the economy, to perhaps traipse back into offices, to start eating out again, etc. And now we've got the Prime Minister actually all over the front pages warning about a second wave. And I think if it continues to look worrying in terms of an uptick in infection rate, we should expect to see more of that messaging from Boris Johnson in the weeks to come. So I do think it's quite a worrying picture. I mean, daily infections are still low, but there's been that uptick. And when you look at what's happening in Europe, lots of countries seem to have been seeing an uptick in the recent kind of week or two, not just Spain, but in Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg are some of the countries that fear they're at risk of a second wave.
Yes, the Metro Europe has a second wave. Brits returning with COVID led to the quarantine crackdown, says the Prime Minister. We can show you the Times as well. You quoted the figures there, suggesting that travellers to Belgium, Luxembourg and Croatia face quarantine measures on the return to England. The newspaper suggesting, and we haven't confirmed this, as early as Thursday, ministers are keeping a close eye on Croatia, but restrictions are not expected imminently. Clearly, some people may be driving through those countries, Belgium and Luxembourg, at least to get elsewhere in Europe. So everybody keeping a close eye on that. The question for the UK, I suppose, Isabel, is whether the lockdown restrictions that we might have to endure again can be simply based on local areas seeing spikes, or whether it has to be more broadly again. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I just don't think that the nation can take another wholesale lockdown. I just really don't think that's an option. I mean, we've barely come out of the last one. You know, anyone who's been in central London lately can see that it's still a dead zone, parts of it. I mean, I've been travelling in and out periodically on the trains, and I have my own chauffeur-driven train at peak time. I mean, this is, you know, in no way any kind of back to normality. As we all know, offices are pretty deserted. Most central London offices are running at kind of 10 to 20% capacity. So I don't think we can put the brakes right back on again. I think local lockdowns, if they have to happen at all, are the answer. And I don't accept that the government has been in some way sort of mixed messaging or tardy on this in terms of people who've gone abroad. You know, anyone who's gone abroad at the moment must know, they must have a level of common sense to imagine that going on a foreign holiday right now is a risk. You know, there are corona cases all over Europe. I'm just back from Amsterdam, and you know, over there it's as if corona doesn't actually exist at the moment. You know, there's a really casual attitude. There are no masks being worn. You know, social distancing doesn't really seem to be a thing except on paper. So I can imagine that there'll be an uptick there too. But in the end, you know, people have to take their own attitude to risk and be careful. And, you know, the Prime Minister reiterates to stay alert, which is, I think, as much as many people want to do at this point.
Yes, I went to my local high street today. Lots of mask wearing, but it has to be said it's being hollowed out. Shops are closing all the time. It's feeling very empty and very depressing. You can see why the government wants people to go shopping or go back to the office. Is there a cleverer way of tackling this? For example, the quarantine measures. The Guardian talking about travellers' quarantine could be cut in half. What are the suggestions, Sonia?
So the suggestion here, coming from the government and others, is that actually if you tested travellers as soon as they come back, and then a few days after they come back, so the suggestion is if you test them on day 7 or 8 and they have 2 negative tests, that actually picks up 94% of people who are ever going to test positive for COVID. Because obviously the reason why we've got a 14-day quarantine is that it takes some time, or it can take some time, for the symptoms to show. So that's one solution for people coming back abroad, but it only shows a few days off, and also it costs money. So you know, there's some suggestion that a test when you first arrive back at an airport would be £150. Now for most people that's a huge cost on top of their holiday costs. So I'm not sure that that's going to sort of not put people off going abroad. But I think more broadly in terms of measures, I think there has to be a focus on getting this test, track and trace infrastructure up and running, because that's how you avoid a national lockdown if there is a second wave and if there is an uptick in infections. You zero in on it as soon as it happens in a very hyper-local area, and that stops you having to close a whole city down. But we know that that infrastructure still doesn't quite exist, and that's a real problem, and I think the government have got quite a lot to answer for on that.
Yes, the Telegraph also with that story about testing at airports, the boss of Heathrow Airport suggesting he could have that £150 test up and running in 2 weeks. So that's their lead story. Just below that, there is something you've also picked up on, this idea about a K-shaped recovery. Isabel, what's a K-shaped recovery?
Well, we've heard about the L-shaped recovery, and we've heard about the V-shaped recovery, and now we've got the K-shaped recovery, where some people are going in an upwards trajectory. Those that have not been affected so much by the lockdown, generally white-collar workers who've actually in some ways found themselves better off. Their salaries have kept going and they've been able to save a lot of money during the lockdown period, versus those that have lost their jobs and are now facing economic doom, and they're the kind of bottom kick of the K. I mean, this is getting a bit silly now, though, really, isn't it? Are we going to also have a sort of W-shaped recovery where we go up and down and up again, or maybe an X-shaped recovery, which means no recovery at all, or, you know, goodness knows what else? By the time the coronavirus vaccine is discovered, no doubt we'll have been halfway through the alphabet.
But the point, I suppose, is it increases the social divide, which many people say is already there. Sonia, just very, very briefly on that point then.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a real concern, I think, that this lockdown has widened the gap between the haves and the have-not. So actually in a year we could be looking back on the lockdown as a time where inequality, already really high in the UK, got even wider, as some people were able to build up their savings and some people, you know, got more into debt.
Back in a moment with both of you. Thank you so far. Next, though, we will be talking about, for years we've heard that children who take music lessons will become talented in other areas, but that may not be true. We will find out more after this. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome back to both of you. Now, a cautious hope of an early test for Alzheimer's. I have to confess I'm cautious about this. I'm not sure I would like to know 2 decades in advance if this was my fate. Sonia, what are your thoughts?
So at last, some good news stories. I think this is good news. I think you're right, Anna, that it would be really difficult to know that this is your fate 20 years in advance. But the reason why scientists are so positive about this early test for Alzheimer's, it could let you know that you will go on to develop dementia 20 years before the onset of very serious symptoms. The reason why that's a good thing is that it gives a lot of new hope for early treatments. And scientists think that we're much more likely to be in a place where there are treatments that can really delay the onset of the very significant cognitive loss and memory loss that comes with dementia. It's such a cruel disease. And so, you know, maybe you could put that off by another 10 or 20 years and really, really improve people who do develop dementia, improve their quality of life. So I think this is good news more from a treatment perspective rather than sort of telling people, oh, well, you're going to have dementia in 20 years. I agree with you. That's not, you know, you wouldn't really want to have that hanging over you.
Yes, if only there were treatments, I suppose. That's the point, isn't it? But they're all working towards that, I guess. Meanwhile, let's talk about brain development at a different, normally a different age range anyway. This is in the Times. Take note, music lessons will not turn children into geniuses. Now, we always were told, weren't we, that it might develop your maths brain or something like that. Isabel?
Yeah, that's right. So this is sorry tidings for millions of parents up and down the country that pour all that money into music lessons and playing Mozart to their unborn babies in the womb, and in the hope that in some way it makes them smarter. Scientists have now studied a whole load of research, something like 54 separate studies involving 7,000 children, and concluded that there isn't actually any kind of causal link between children who have music lessons and go on to have higher IQ. It's just that there's a correlation. So it may well be that children that actually enjoy music and get on well with their music lessons are more intelligent anyway. So don't waste your money on, you know, trying to bring up a baby Mozart in the hope that they'll turn into an Einstein, seems to be the message.
Yeah, I have to confess I was feeling bad about my daughter doing the drums and nothing else, but there we are. The double page spread in the Times, their main headline is 3 billion animals killed in Australian fires, which is very depressing. But you wanted to cheer us up, Sonia, with a pig and an Instagram star. Tell us more.
Yeah, Bobby the Insta pig. So this is a story of a very sort of big and rare breed of pig in Germany worth a lot of money, and he just would not basically accede to being slaughtered. So he just kept on running away. He did it about 3 or 4 times. And it was a very successful strategy because he now weighs more than 200 kilograms, which means he can't go to the abattoir. He's just too big. So instead, his owners have decided to make him into an Instagram star. Although I have to say, he's only got 3,000 followers. And as far as I'm aware, I'm not on Instagram, but that would represent quite a dropping of the bar of what it means to be an Insta star. As I understand it, you know, some pets have, or animals have, millions of followers. But, you know, it seems to say Bobby, he has a £100 a month food bill, so it's quite high. And his owners are looking to use Instagram to help cover the cost of his feed.
Sonia, we're just missing a photo, I think, aren't we? Both of you, thank you so much. Isabel, Sonia, thank you.